The heat in the valley was a living thing, a dry, shimmering beast that pressed down on the earth until the very air seemed to crackle. It was the kind of afternoon where the world holds its breath, and the only movement was the slow, patient circling of a hawk high above the scrubland. The rancher's daughter was mending a fence where the cedar posts had gone soft, her hands rough and capable, her thoughts 1,000 miles away in a book she'd read about places with too much rain. She didn't hear him approach. One moment she was alone with the vast, empty sky, and the next she felt the weight of a gaze upon her back, a silence within the silence that was altogether different. She turned, and there he was, a shadow-given form at the edge of the pines. He stood so still he might have been one of the ancient, wind-carved stones that dotted the foothills. He was Apache, that much was clear from the proud set of his shoulders and the long, dark hair tied back with a strip of leather. But his clothes were a patchwork of survival-worn boots, trousers faded by sun and salt, a cavalry jacket too heavy for the day, missing its buttons. This was not a man coming from a village. This was a man coming from nowhere. Her hand went to the old rifle leaning against the fence post, but she didn't lift it. His own hands were empty, held slightly away from his body in a gesture that spoke of exhaustion, not threat. It was his eyes that stopped her. They were dark and deep-set, holding a history of landscapes she could only imagine, but in them was a raw, unmistakable loneliness, a solitude so complete it seemed to echo in the space between them. It was the look of a man who had been walking a long, hard road with only ghosts for company. For a long moment they just watched each other, two creatures from different worlds meeting in a scarred slice of land that history had not yet finished arguing over. The rancher father had carved out with sweat and stubbornness, was his by white man's law, by filed claims and bought deeds. But the man in front of her, his feet planted on the red earth, was a part of that earth in a way her family could never be. He belonged to the older story, the one written in wind and warrior tracks, a story that was being erased day by plows and wire fences. He took a single step forward, not toward her, but just close enough so his voice wouldn't have to travel far. It was a low sound, gravelly from disuse and dust, yet it carried with a startling clarity. He spoke not in the formal, hesitant English of the few Apache who sometimes came to trade, but in a blunt, weary rhythm that cut straight to the bone. "None of my tribe can stand me," he said, the words hanging in the hot air like a confession. Then, after a pause that stretched her nerves thin, he added, the whisper so soft she had to lean in to catch it, "I hope you can." The statement was so vast, so loaded with unspoken stories of betrayal and exile, that it left no room for simple questions. It wasn't an introduction. It was an opening of a wound. Why would his own people cast him out? What line had he crossed, or what truth had he refused to deny? Was he a murderer, a thief, a man cursed by his own spirits? Or was he something else, a man who saw the coming tide and refused to drown quietly, a prophet deemed a pariah? She knew the rules. Her father's voice, hard as saddle leather, rang in her memory. "You see one of them loitering, you get inside, you don't talk, you don't offer water. You get the rifle? Every neighbor for 50 miles would say the same." Fear was the common currency here, born from years of bloody raids and brutal reprisals, a cycle of violence that had left deep grooves of hatred on both sides. To show kindness to a solitary Apache, especially one his own people had rejected, was not just foolish. It was dangerous. It could bring trouble nobody needed. But looking at him, she didn't see the painted raider of bedtime stories. She saw a man at the very end of his strength. The dust on him was ground in deep. A dark stain on the sleeve of his jacket might have been old blood. His pride was evident, but it was the pride of a cliff edge crumbling into the sea, a final, defiant stand before the fall. That quiet, "I hope you can," wasn't a demand. It was the last coin in his pocket, offered not for pity, but for a chance, however slim, of being seen as a man, not just an enemy. Her own life on the ranch was one of quiet endurance, of chores that never ended, and a future that seemed as fixed and dry as the horizon. She understood, in a way, what it was to feel apart. The loneliness of the land could get inside you. His was a loneliness of the soul, a complete severing from the very roots that gave a person meaning. In his whispered hope, she heard a mirror of her own unspoken yearning for something more, for a story that was her own. She didn't speak. Instead, she moved slowly, deliberately, turning to the canteen hanging from the saddle of her patient Mare. The water inside sloshed, a precious sound in the dryness. She uncorked it, took a few steps forward, and set it on a flat rock halfway between them, a neutral ground. Then she stepped back, her heart drumming against her ribs. It was a small thing, a gesture from one thirsty creature to another, but in that place at that time it was a monumental act. It was a thread thrown across a canyon. He looked at the canteen, then back at her face, his expression unreadable. The hawk cried out above, a lonely sound. Finally he moved. He didn't rush. He walked to the rock, knelt with a slight wince of pain, and lifted the canteen. He drank, not greedily, but with a deep gratitude that was painful to witness. When he lowered it, water glistened on his stubbled chin. He placed the canteen back on the rock with a care that felt like a ceremony. "They call me," he began, his voice a little stronger now, the one who walks between. "I saw that the old ways of fighting would only end in dust. I spoke for talking. For a different path." He said this not with pride, but with a crushing sadness. "To my people this made me a ghost, a coward, a tongue for the white eyes. To the blue coats and the settlers I am still just an Apache. A Wolf to be shot." He gave a short, bitter shake of his head. "There is no place for a man who stands in the middle when the ground is splitting apart." He was telling her he was a traitor to everyone. A man without a country, a people, a home. And he had come here, to the edge of her father's claimed kingdom, to whisper his hope to a girl mending a fence. The absurdity of it was overshadowed by the terrifying weight of it. He wasn't just passing through. He was carrying a war within him, and he had just laid its banner at her feet. Before she could form a thought, a new sound cut through the stillness, the distant but unmistakable jingle of harness and the creak of a loaded wagon. Her father was returning from town, and he wasn't alone. She could hear the deeper rumble of a neighbor's voice. They would be at the crest of the hill in minutes, and they would have a clear view down into this corner of the pasture. A bolt of pure panic shot through her. She looked from the man to the approaching dust cloud on the road, her mind racing. If they saw him, there would be no questions. Her father and the neighbor were good men, by their own lights, but they were men who had buried friends. They would see a threat, an intruder, a target. The rifle shot would be swift, the consequences buried with the body. The Apache followed her gaze. He understood instantly. The weary resignation in his eyes hardened into something else, a sharp, focused awareness. He was no longer just a tired outcast. He was a warrior again, reading the land and the danger. He didn't run. He looked back at her, and in that final, electric second, the question that had been hanging between them since he first spoke became urgent and inescapable. She had given him water. Would she now, by word or silence, give him his life? The wagon was closer now, the voices carrying on the thin air. She could make out her father's laugh, a warm sound that felt like it belonged to a different world. The Apache took one step back toward the pines, his body coiled, his eyes locked on hers, waiting. The space between them was no longer just air. It was a bridge she had to either cross or burn. One word, one shout of warning to her father, and the story of the lone Apache would end here, in the dirt of her family's land. One moment of continued silence, and she became his accomplice, tying her fate to a man rejected by two worlds. The wagon rolled around the final bend, the horses' heads coming into view. She opened her mouth. The sound that escaped her was not a word, but a sharp, choked breath, a gasp caught between fear and decision. It was enough. His dark eyes, which had been holding on to hers with the weight of a last chance, flickered not with anger, but with a swift understanding. He moved like water flowing over stone, a silent, seamless retreat into the deeper shadows of the pines. One moment he was a man standing in the harsh sunlight, the next he was a suggestion of movement, and then he was gone, swallowed whole by the land that had borne him. She stood frozen, the canteen on the rock a damning piece of evidence. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that seemed loud enough to summon the men in the wagon. With a surge of motion that felt clumsy and slow, she snatched the canteen, the metal warm from the sun, and shoved it back onto her saddle. She grabbed the rifle, not to use, but to have in her hands, something normal, something that belonged to the girl she had been just 10 minutes before. She forced her shoulders down, tried to smooth the panic from her face into something like weary concentration, and turned back to the splintered fence post, as if it were the only thing in the world. The wagon wheels groaned to a halt on the other side of the wire. "Getting the best of that old cedar, are you?" Her father's voice was a familiar rumble, tinged with the dry good humor he carried like a well-worn tool. She turned, managing a nod, hoping the smile on her face didn't look as brittle as it felt. "It's putting up a fight." Her own voice sounded strange to her ears, too high, too tight. Her father, a broad man with a beard the color of old straw and eyes permanently narrowed from squinting at horizons, leaned on the wagon seat. Beside him sat their neighbor, a lean, weathered man with a long face and hands that were never still. The neighbor's gaze was already sweeping the tree line, a habitual, wary scanning. He was a man who had lost cattle to predators of both the four-legged and two-legged variety, and trust was not in his nature. "Seen anything out of the ordinary?" the neighbor asked, his voice like grating stones. It was his standard greeting, his constant question. The lie came to her lips, dry and quick as a desert lizard. "Nothing but the heat and that hawk." She gestured vaguely upward where the bird still turned its slow circles. "It's been quiet." "Quiet's good," her father said, but he was looking at her now, a faint crease between his brows. He knew her moods, the set of her jaw when something was amiss. "You look flushed." "This sun'll bake your brains if you let it. Come on up, ride back with us." "That post can wait for the morning cool." It was not a suggestion. To argue would be to invite more questions. She tied her mare to the back of the wagon and climbed up onto the hard board seat beside the neighbor, the rifle cradled awkwardly in her lap. As the wagon lurched forward, she felt the space behind them, the wall of pines, like a physical pull. She fought the urge to look back, knowing the neighbor's restless eyes missed little. She focused on the dusty backs of the horses, on the familiar, rhythmic bounce of the wagon. The men talked of town, of the price of hides, of a rumor that a railroad surveyor might be coming through next season. Their words were the ordinary music of her life, but now they seemed to dance on the surface of something far deeper and more treacherous. The Apache's whisper coiled in her mind, a snake of sound in the tall grass of her thoughts. "None of my tribe can stand me. What did a man do to earn such complete exile? Was it truly just for speaking of peace?" The stories she'd heard around campfires and stovetops spoke of Apache fierceness, their tight-knit clans, their unbreakable loyalty. To be cast out from that was a punishment worse than death. It was to become a ghost while still breathing. And he had chosen to come here. To her, not to the Fort miles to the east, not to some trading post. He had found this specific corner of her father's range. The thought was a cold trickle down her spine. Had he been watching? For how long? Did he know her routines, the paths she rode to check the springs, the hours she spent alone? The idea should have terrified her, and it did. But tangled in the fear was a thread of something else, a dreadful, fascinating sense of being seen, chosen for a reason she could not fathom. At night, the ranch house felt different. The lamplight, usually a warm, golden pool pushing back the vast, friendly dark, now seemed feeble, creating more shadows than it banished. Every creak of settling timber was a footfall. The wind sighing through the eaves was a whispered voice. She moved through her chores washing the supper plates, banking the fire with her nerves stretched taut. Her father sat in his rocker, mending a bridle, his large hands moving with steady surety. He looked up at her as she dried the last tin plate. "You're jumpy as a cat tonight," he said, his tone casual but his eyes keen. "Just tired," she said, turning away to hang the towel. "That sun was heavy." He was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the soft pull of waxed thread through leather. "Old man Crenshaw," he began, using the neighbor's name, "said he thought he saw a shadow move up in the high pasture 2 days back. Could have been a bear. Could have been nothing." He paused, letting the words hang. "But you know how he is?" "He's got it in his head some of the people might be drifting back through, looking for trouble or looking to steal. Says he's going to ride the High Line tomorrow with his boy and a couple of dogs." Her blood seemed to still in her veins. The high pasture was a rugged, beautiful place of granite outcrops and hidden springs. It was also the back door to the valley, a maze of trails known only to the deer, and, she supposed, to men who had lived there for 1,000 years. It was a perfect place for a lone man to hide. "Do you think he's right?" she asked, keeping her back to him, focusing on the simple act of folding the towel. "I think a man who's lost as much as Crenshaw sees enemies in every shadow," her father said, a note of weary sympathy in his voice. "But that don't mean the shadows are always empty." He finished his stitch and bit the thread off. "I want you to stick close to the house tomorrow, you hear? No riding out alone until this feeling passes." It was a reasonable request, a father's caution. To him, it was about safety, about the known dangers of a still wild land. To her, it felt like a door slamming shut on a secret she wasn't even sure she wanted to keep. She merely nodded, a good daughter obeying a sensible rule. In her small room under the eaves, sleep would not come. The moon rose, a bone-white sliver casting a feeble light that painted the floorboards silver. She replayed the afternoon in her mind, every detail, the way he had materialized. The dust ground into the fibers of his jacket, the stark, simple tragedy of his statement, "I hope you can." He hadn't asked for shelter, or food, or a horse. He had asked for something far more perilous, understanding, a recognition of his humanity. And in her silent, frozen moment of panic, she had given it. By not raising the alarm, by letting him vanish, she had, in some small way, answered his hope. But what now? He was out there in the cooling night, a man hunted by his past and by his future. Crenshaw and his dogs would be coming at first light. Did the Apache know? Had he seen the neighbor's suspicious eyes scanning the trees? He was a man who walked between, he'd said, a man for whom there was no place. Her ranch, her family's claim, was now the fragile, dangerous ground he stood upon. A new, more practical fear began to gnaw at her. If Crenshaw found him, there would be a fight. Shots would ring out across the canyon, and if the Apache was killed, what then? Would she spend the rest of her life wondering what his full story was, why he had come to her? And if by some wild chance he survived, if he was forced to fight his way out, the retaliation would be swift and terrible. The fragile, tense peace of the valley would shatter. Her father, Crenshaw, every homestead for miles would band together for a war party. They would not rest until the renegade was dead, and they might not care which Apache paid the price. Her single act of withheld silence could be the spark that burned everything down. She rose from her bed, drawn to the small window that looked out toward the dark hump of the hills. The world was immense and silent. Somewhere in that ocean of night was one man, alone. He was a problem, a threat, a walking piece of trouble. He was also, she realized with a clarity that stole her breath, utterly dependent on the one person in this vast territory who knew he was there and had not yet condemned him. Her. The weight of it settled on her, heavier than any sack of grain she'd ever hoisted. This was not a story from a book. This was dirt and blood and consequence. She had to know more. She had to understand what she was harboring, even if it was just in the secret space of her own knowledge. She couldn't let Crenshaw stumble upon him blindly. But to go against her father's direct word, to venture out toward a man who was a stranger to every law she knew, was to step off the solid ground of her life into a terrifying unknown. As the first faint hint of gray touched the eastern sky, the decision hardened within her, cold and sharp as a blade. She would not wait for the dogs and the guns to decide the day. She would go back to the fence line at first light, before her father stirred. She would go to the place where the shadow had been, and she would wait. It was a reckless, foolish plan. But the memory of his eyes, holding a loneliness so profound it seemed to echo her own quieter solitude, would not let her be. He had whispered his hope into the silence. She had to know if she had been right to catch it. The valley was holding its breath, as she was about to step into the very center of the storm, armed with nothing but a canteen of water and a question that could get them both killed. The gray light before dawn was a thief, stealing the solid shapes of the night and leaving behind a world of ghosts. She moved through the quiet house with a care that felt like a betrayal, her boots in her hand, her heart a frantic bird trapped in her chest. The floorboards, usually so familiar, seemed to creak with newfound treachery under her stocking feet. She left a note on the kitchen table, a simple lie that felt like ash in her mouth. Gone to check the east spring before the heat. Back soon. She saddled her Mari in the half-dark. the horse blowing softly into the cool air, sensing her rider's tension. Every second was a lifetime, every rustle from the chicken coop a potential alarm. She rode out not with the boldness of purpose, but with the clenched dread of someone walking a narrow ledge. The world was still holding its breath, painted in shades of charcoal and deep blue. She took a long, looping route, avoiding the main trail that led to the high pasture where Crenshaw would soon be riding. Instead, she cut through a dry wash, the sandy bottom muffling her horse's steps. Her mind was a storm of doubts. This was madness. She was risking everything: her father's trust, her own safety, the fragile peace of their home, for a man whose name she did not know, whose story was only a haunting fragment. Yet the image of him placing the canteen back on the rock with that deliberate care was a hook in her soul. It was a gesture of thanks, of respect. A man who did that was not merely an animal or a monster. He was a person carrying a world of hurt. She reached the fence line as the first true rays of sun gilded the highest pine tops. The place was empty, just as she had left it, the broken post a silent witness. She dismounted, her legs unsteady, and led her Murray into the thicker shade at the wood's edge. She waited, straining her ears for anything beyond the morning chatter of birds. Minutes stretched, each one amplifying the voice in her head that called her a fool. He was likely miles away by now, a smart man putting distance between himself and trouble. The relief that thought brought was hollow, edged with a strange disappointment. Then, from the deep stillness of the pines, a gambel's quail called. It was a sound she knew well, the three-part bob-white whistle. But it came again, a beat too perfect, a repetition too exact. A signal, not from a bird, but from a man who knew the language of this land better than she ever would. He emerged not from where he had vanished the day before, but from a different point entirely, moving with a silence that was both beautiful and unsettling. He had washed somewhere. His face was clean, the sharp planes of his cheeks and brow stark in the dappled light. He looked at her, then past her, his eyes scanning the open pasture, the ridges, confirming she was alone. The weariness was still there, carved into the lines around his eyes, but it was joined now by a focused intensity. "You came back," he said. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact tinged with what might have been wonder. "You're still here," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "The old man with the long face and the dogs is in the high country," he said, his gaze drifting north. "He looks for sign where the stone is bare. He will not find me there." He looked back at her. "But you look here, why?" It was the question she had been asking herself all night. She had no easy answer. "You asked me if I could stand you," she said finally, the words feeling inadequate. "I don't know if I can. I don't know anything about you. But I knew they would come with guns today. I couldn't just let that happen without knowing more." He considered this, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he was silent, as if weighing the worth of his own story. He settled on the ground, not like a man relaxing, but like a man preparing for a long, difficult task. He gestured for her to sit on a fallen log nearby, a gesture that held a quiet, ancient formality. She did, the rough bark biting through her trousers. "My people call me Nantan Lanero," he began, using the word slowly. "It means—" "Talking chief, not a chief of war, but a speaker?" "A listener." He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred. "When the bluecoats came with their endless numbers, their big guns, I saw what my war chief did not. I saw the end. I saw our children hungry, our horses taken, our places of power fenced. I said we must speak with these men, not just fight them. We must find a way to live, even if the living is small." He spoke not with pride, but with a crushing resignation. To speak of this was to touch poison. To my war chief I was a coward, my words a sickness that would weaken our spirits. To the young men I was an old woman, trying to leash the wolf before it could bite. At the last council, when the war party painted themselves for a raid on a settlement, I stood and spoke against it. I said it would bring only more soldiers, more death. They said my heart was white. They said I had taken the white man's smoke into my spirit. He looked up, and the pain in his eyes was a physical thing. "They did not kill me. That would have been a kindness." They told me to walk. To take my white heart and go live with the people I loved so much. They turned their backs. My wife, my sister, they looked at the ground. I was no longer there. The sheer, brutal loneliness of it took her breath away. It was a punishment worse than any bullet. To be erased by the very people who gave your life meaning. "And the white men?" she asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. A grim, humorless smile touched his lips. "I went to the fort. I stood before the Iron Shirt chief and said I was Nantan Lanero, that I spoke for peace." He laughed. He said in Apache talking of peace was a snake offering not to bite. He said if I was not gone by sundown, his soldiers would use me for target practice. I was a joke to them. A stray dog, he picked up a pine needle, rolling it between his fingers. "So I walk. I am a ghost to my people. I am a pest to yours. There is no hole in this world for me." The truth of it was devastating. He was a man caught in the crushing gears of history, his very existence an offense to both sides. His crime was a vision of a different way, and for that he had lost everything. Why come here? She pressed, the core of her fear rising up. "To this ranch?" He met her gaze directly. 3 days ago, I was at the far edge of this valley, near the salt flats. I saw you. You were pulling a calf from the mud. It was stuck, its mother crazy with fear. You were alone. You did not panic. You talked to the calf, soft words, even as you pulled. You got the rope. You pulled it free. You did not see me watching." He paused. "You showed patience. You showed a heart that was not quick to anger or fear. I have watched many ranchers. They shout, they kick. They fight the land. You worked with it. I thought, perhaps this one will hear a few words before she reaches for a rifle." His observation was so precise, so personal, it felt like he had seen straight into her. That day with the calf had been a minor thing, a simple chore. To him it had been a sign, a reading of her character from a distance. It was terrifying and profoundly flattering all at once. He had chosen her not by chance, but by a calculated assessment of her nature. Before she could respond, the distant, sharp report of a rifle shot cracked across the morning stillness. Then another. They came from the direction of the high pasture. The Apache was on his feet in an instant, his body tense, all his senses focused on the sound. The shots were not the spaced, deliberate firing of hunters. They were rapid, urgent. "Crenshaw," she breathed, a cold dread washing over her. The Apache listened, his head cocked. "Not at me," he said after a moment. "The sound is wrong. The echo, it is from the Box Canyon. They have found something else." He looked at her, his eyes grave. "Or something else has found them." The silence that followed the gunshots was deeper and more ominous than the noise itself. It was a held breath, a waiting. The birds had gone quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause. The Apache, Nantan Lanero, stood frozen, every line of his body tuned to the distant canyon. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes burned with a rapid calculation. "They are not shooting at a man," he said, his voice low and certain. The shots were fast, panicked. 2 rifles, maybe 3. Then nothing. He turned his gaze to her, and the gravity in it pinned her to the spot. A bear, perhaps. A mountain lion with young, or what? The words were a dry whisper. "Or they have stumbled into something they did not expect," he finished. He didn't elaborate, but the implication hung in the air between them, another war party, a group of his own people who had not chosen the path of talking. The fragile, private understanding they had forged in this clearing was suddenly exposed to the violent realities of the world beyond it. Another sound reached them then, faint but unmistakable, the high, terrified whinny of a horse, and then the frantic baying of dogs, the sound rolling down from the high rocks. It was the sound of chaos. Her mind raced, a storm of terrible images. Crenshaw and his boy lying broken among the stones. Her father, hearing the shots from the ranch house, grabbing his own rifle and riding out into a fight he didn't understand. This was the very disaster she had feared, unfolding not because of the man before her, but perhaps in spite of him. And she was here, hidden at the wood's edge with the very person everyone would blame. "I have to go," she said, the words torn from her. "My father will hear. He'll come, if he finds you here after this." He nodded, a sharp, understanding motion. "Go. Take the low trail along the creek bed. It is hidden. You can reach your home from the south. They will not see you." He was giving her a way out, protecting her even as his own danger multiplied tenfold. But the thought of leaving him here felt like a different kind of betrayal. What will you do? For the first time, a flicker of the old warrior spirit showed in his eyes, not as anger, but as a cold, clear resolve. I will go to the high place and look. I must know what has happened, if it is my people. He trailed off, the pain of that possibility raw on his face. If it is my people, then I am already dead anyway. Go, now. There was no time to argue. She mounted her mare, her hands clumsy on the reins. She looked down at him, this lonely figure who had asked for nothing but to be heard. The world was crashing in around them, and their whispered counsel was over. Be careful, she said, the words utterly inadequate. He simply raised a hand, a gesture of both farewell and warning, and then melted back into the pines, moving with a speed and silence that seemed inhuman. She urged her mare down into the dry creek bed he had indicated, the horse's hooves crunching on the gravel. She rode hard, her heart pounding in time with the gallop, the low branches whipping at her shoulders. The rational part of her screamed that she was riding away from the trouble, that she should get home, lock the door, and let the men handle it. But another part, a part that had been awakened by his stark honesty and profound isolation, knew that was no longer possible. She was involved. Her silence had made her so. She approached the ranch from the south, as he'd advised, and saw immediately that the damage was done. Her father was already in the yard, throwing a saddle onto his big roan gelding. His face was set in a grim line she knew well, the look he got when a blight threatened the crops or a wolf got into the sheep. He saw her coming and straightened up, his eyes sweeping over her, taking in her disheveled hair, the dust on her clothes from the creek bed. "Where have you been?" he demanded, his voice tight. "You hear those shots?" "I was at the East Spring," she said, the lie tasting more bitter than ever. "I heard them. What is it?" "Crenshaw's in trouble, that's what it is," he said, cinching the saddle strap with a hard yank. "2 shots, then that ruckus with the horses. Something's wrong. I'm riding up. You get in the house. Bolt the door, I mean it. Take the shotgun and stay by the window." "Let me come with you," she blurted out, the urge to see, to know, overwhelming her fear. "Absolutely not," he said, his tone leaving no room. "This is man's work now. I don't know what's up there, but if Crenshaw's hurt, or worse—" He didn't finish the thought. He swung up into the saddle, the rifle in its scabbard by his knee. "Get inside, now." He kicked the roan into a lope and was gone, a cloud of dust marking his path toward the high pasture. She stood alone in the sudden quiet of the yard, the sun now high and hot, the chickens pecking obliviously at the dirt. The ordinary life of the ranch continued, oblivious to the fault line that had just opened up beneath it. She did not go inside. She stood rooted to the spot, her mind a whirlwind. Nanton Lanero was moving toward the same danger. Her father was riding into it, armed and expecting the worst. They were on a collision course, and she was the only one who knew the full, tragic truth of the man in the middle. If they met, her father would see an Apache, a threat. Nanton Lanero, cornered and desperate, might see just another white man with a gun. The truth of his heart wouldn't matter in the split second it took to pull a trigger. The weight of her inaction became unbearable. She couldn't stay here, waiting for a shot to echo that would break her world in two. She ran to the barn, not for her mare, but for the old, steady mule they used for packing. It was slower, but it was silent and sure-footed in the rocks. She let it out, not bothering with a saddle, just a bridle and a rope halter. She had no plan, only a driving need to get between the 2 men who, in their own ways, held pieces of her life. She took a different path, a treacherous, little-used game trail that wound up the backside of the ridge overlooking the Box Canyon. It was a longer, harder climb, but it would bring her to the high ground above where the trouble had started. The mule plodded with patient endurance, and she clung to its back, her body tense, her ears straining for any sound from above. The smell reached her first, the sharp, coppery tang of blood on the hot air. Then she heard the low, pained whimper of a dog. She urged the mule the last few yards, dismounting before it cleared the scrub oak, and crept forward on her hands and knees to the lip of the ridge. The scene below was one of brutal, confused violence. It was not a war party. It was a grizzly bear, a massive, tawny-colored sow, now lying dead in a patch of churned earth and shattered manzanita, One of Crenshaw's dogs lay motionless nearby. The other was licking a gash on its flank, whimpering. Crenshaw's horse was gone, probably bolted. And Crenshaw himself was slumped against a rock, his shirt sleeve dark and wet, his face pale. His boy, looking no more than 14, was kneeling beside him, trying to bind the wound with a torn strip of his own shirt, his hands shaking badly. Her father was just riding into the far end of the canyon, his rifle now in his hands as he took in the scene. He saw the dead bear, the wounded man, and his posture shifted from offensive alert to urgent concern. He hurried his horse forward, dismounting and kneeling beside Crenshaw. From her vantage point, her heart pounding in her throat, she scanned the opposite rim of the canyon. And there he was, Nantan Lanero. He was crouched behind a finger of granite, looking down at the same scene. He was not looking at the bear or at the wounded white man. He was looking at her father, his hand resting on the bone handle of the knife at his belt. He was assessing the new arrival, a potential threat entering an unstable situation. Her father, busy with Crenshaw, was oblivious. But Crenshaw, in his pain and shock, suddenly pointed a trembling finger up toward the opposite ridge. "I saw him!" he cried out, his voice raw and ragged. "Before the bear, I saw an Apache up on the rocks. He's watching us right now, I swear it." Her father's head snapped up, his eyes following Crenshaw's pointing finger. He squinted against the sun, scanning the rocks. From her hiding place, she saw Nantan Lanero tense, his body coiling to either flee or fight. Her father couldn't see him clearly, not yet, but he believed Crenshaw. He reached slowly for the rifle he had laid on the ground beside him. Time seemed to slow, thickening like cold honey. She saw the two men, separated by a canyon and a world of misunderstanding, connected only by the thread of her secret and the panic of a wounded man. If her father lifted that rifle, Nantan Lanero would vanish, or worse, he would feel he had no choice but to defend himself. The fragile hope he had whispered would be shattered forever, buried under a new layer of fear and violence. She didn't think, she acted. She stood up from her hiding place, fully visible on her own ridge, directly between their lines of sight. She raised her empty hands high above her head, a silhouette against the sky. Both men froze. Her father stared, confusion and then dawning horror on his face as he recognized her. Across the canyon, Nantan Lanero's eyes locked onto hers, wide with disbelief. She had stepped into the open, into the crossfire of their worlds, with nothing but her own fragile self as a shield. The next move was theirs, and the fate of all of them hung on a breath, on a glance, on the terrible, waiting silence. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, nothing moved. The world was a painting. The dead bear, the wounded man, the boy with his bloody hands, the two armed men on opposite ridges, and between them, a girl with her arms stretched toward the sky. The only sound was the pained panting of Crenshaw and the low whine of his surviving dog. Her father was the first to break the spell. His face, etched with a confusion that quickly hardened into a protective fury, contorted, "Get down!" he roared, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. He snatched up his rifle, but he didn't point it across the canyon. Instead, he swung it wildly, covering the whole scene, unsure where the true threat lay. His focus was fractured between his wounded neighbor, his defiant daughter, and the phantom Apache his neighbor had seen. Across the divide, Nantan Lanero did not flee. He did not reach for a weapon. He slowly, deliberately rose from his crouch behind the rock. He stood in full view, a solitary figure against the vastness of the sky. He kept his hands open and away from his body, mirroring her gesture in a way. But his eyes were fixed on her father, not on her. It was a warrior's assessment, a man measuring the mettle of another. Crenshaw cried out again, a guttural sound of fear and pain. "There, it's him! Shoot him!" Her father's rifle barrel wavered, centering on the Apache. His finger tightened on the trigger. It was the moment she had feared most, the inevitable end of every story she'd ever heard in this valley. "No!" Her voice, sharp and clear, cut through the tension like a knife. She didn't shout, she commanded. "Father, don't! He's not with the bear. He didn't cause this. Look at him!" Her father's gaze flicked to her, his eyes blazing. "Get out of the line of sight, now!" "He came to me yesterday," she pressed on, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "At the fence line. He was alone. He was thirsty." He told me his people cast him out because he spoke for peace. He's got nowhere to go. He's just alone. She kept her arms raised, a plea in her posture. He could have hidden. He could have run, but he's standing there. Look at him. Her father hesitated, the ingrained instincts of a lifetime at war with the raw, undeniable truth in his daughter's voice and the stark, non-threatening stance of the man across the canyon. The Apache was making no hostile move. He was simply present, exposed slowly, with a tension that vibrated through the air. Her father lowered the rifle a fraction. He didn't put it down, but the immediate danger of a shot passed. He looked from the Apache to Crenshaw, bleeding against the rock, then back to the lone figure. He said that? He spoke for peace? He's called Nantan Lanero, she said, the name feeling both foreign and sacred on her tongue. It means talking chief. A harsh, pained laugh escaped Crenshaw. Talking chief? Lies. All Apaches are liars when it suits them. He's scouting, marking us for a raid. But the boy, who had been silently pressing on his father's wound, spoke up, his voice thin and young. Pa, the bear came out of the thicket behind us? We never saw nothing on the ridge till after. I ain't sure what I saw. The boy's doubt, born of shock and honesty, changed the air. It introduced a crack of uncertainty. Her father seized on it. Can you walk, John? He called to Crenshaw, his voice now all business. Barely, Crenshaw grunted. We need to get you down the mountain, now. Her father made a decision. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, turning his back on the Apache in a gesture that was either supreme confidence or an incredible gamble. He focused on the immediate, practical problem, a wounded man, a dead bear, a long trek home. He moved to help the boy get Crenshaw to his feet. On the opposite ridge, Nantan Lanero watched this. He saw the white rancher choose mercy and practicality over a chase. He saw the trust, however fragile, that the girl's words had sown. He took one last, long look at her. Then, with a grace that seemed to deny the harshness of his existence, he turned and walked away. He didn't run. He simply faded into the landscape, becoming one with the shadows and stones from which he'd come. She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, her arms falling to her sides, suddenly weak. The immediate crisis was over, but a heavier reckoning awaited. The journey down the mountain was slow and silent but for Crenshaw's groans. Her father and the boy half carried the wounded man while she led the horses. The tension between her and her father was a physical wall. He didn't speak to her, his jaw set in a hard line. Only when they had Crenshaw settled in his own bed, his wife fussing with bandages and whiskey, and the boy sent to fetch the doctor from town, did her father turn to her. The ride back to their own ranch was conducted in a silence louder than any argument. In the quiet of their own kitchen, as the late afternoon sun threw long shadows, he finally spoke. Start from the beginning and leave nothing out. So she told him everything. The sudden appearance at the fence, the whispered confession, the canteen of water, her lie of omission, her return at dawn, the Apache's full story, his exile, his rejection by both sides, his observation of her, his choice to seek her out because he saw patience in her. She told it plainly, without adornment, her voice steady even though her hands trembled in her lap. When she finished, her father was silent for a long time. He stared into the cold fireplace, his weathered face unreadable. You took a terrible risk, he said at last, his voice low. You disobeyed me. You put yourself in danger. You kept a secret that could have gotten people killed. I know, she whispered, her eyes on the floor. But, he continued, the word heavy with reluctant thought, you also saw a man where the rest of us only see an Indian. You listened when the rest of us would have shot, and maybe you stopped a killing today that didn't need to happen. He sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to come from his boots. Crenshaw will heal. The bear is dead, and that Apache... He's gone. The world doesn't have a place for him, it seems. Not yet, anyway. He looked at her then, really looked at her, not as his little girl, but as the young woman she had become, one capable of courage, of compassion, and of a stubborn will that mirrored his own. I don't like it, any of it, but I understand it. Just don't ever lie to me again. We face this world together, or we don't face it at all. The relief that washed over her was so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She nodded, unable to speak. Weeks passed. Crenshaw's arm healed, though he kept to a permanent, sour grudge about that lurking Apache. The story in the valley became one of a lucky escape from a grizzly, the fleeting sight of an Indian scout, dismissed as shock and panic. The official truth was simple, comfortable, and left no room for talking chiefs or lonely hopes. But for her, the world was forever altered. She rode the fence lines and checked the springs with a new awareness, feeling the history in the stones, imagining the countless stories that had walked this land unseen. She didn't see Nanton Lanero again. Perhaps he had found a distant, hidden canyon to call his own. Perhaps he was still walking between, a ghost in a changing world. One evening, as she repaired a bridle by the fire, her father spoke without looking up from his ledger. They're talking about forming a proper town council next year. Trying to make things more settled, lawful. He paused. Might be a time when different voices could be heard. If a man had something worthwhile to say. She stopped her work, her heart skipping a beat. He wasn't talking about the townsfolk. He was talking about a future he couldn't quite envision, but that his daughter's actions had forced him to admit might be possible. A future where the ground might not always be splitting apart. She smiled softly, a private smile for a hope that had been whispered and, against all odds, had taken root. The loneliness of the land was still there, but it no longer felt quite so absolute. Somewhere out in the vast, whispering darkness, a man who walked between knew that one person, in one quiet corner of the world, had stood for him. And in that knowledge, for both of them, there was a kind of peace. It was not an ending, but a fragile, hard-won beginning. The story of the lone Apache and the rancher's daughter became not a tale of danger, but a quiet legend in her own heart. A reminder that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is to simply see another person, and in doing so, change the course of everything.